Pastor Vidic asked me to speak. At the same time, he asked Scooter to speak. I responded after a couple of days to Pastor Vidic that I was pretty sure I was supposed to speak on Father's Day. And I didn't know till this morning that Scooter had said to Pastor Vidic, I'm pretty sure that Ed is supposed to speak on Father's Day. We didn't realize, I didn't start to realize until last Sunday that there's really one message. Scooter started it last Sunday, and I've got the wrap up. The way I've come to look at it is Scooter opened a can of worms, and my job is to run it into the carpet. So there's parts of this message that is hard to hear. Pat told me between the services that he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it again because it's like asking for a second living. So there are parts of it that are difficult to deliver, but it's, the best way to look at it is really more like a locker room speech at halftime. There's encouragement there. There's some truth here that isn't easy to hear, but it's also intended to be encouraging. For God intends to us always to be encouraging. Today is Father's Day, as we all know. Today is set aside to honor fathers, which is very cool. Today we're going to look at the roles of the father. There's an obvious bent of this message towards men, but ladies, there's more of you in here. There's something in here for you to hear as well. Mostly because if you hear the way we're supposed to act, then you can hold us accountable to it, since we tend to be easily distracted as men. And women are not so easily distracted in my experience. I'm going to refer to my notes a lot for two reasons. One is my memory is short, but another reason is that God gave me specific things to say. In the last couple of days as I was preparing, he started pouring things into me so quickly that it was all I could do to even type fast enough to get it onto the screen before I forgot. Because Kelly will tell you my memory is about 4 or 5 seconds long. I just don't remember things. There were times where I was just exhausted just because God was giving me so many ideas to get jotted down. Got them all organized, but I don't want to miss any of it, so I'm going to be reading more than I would really prefer to do. So just indulge me in that, if you would. Let's start with the obvious role that we have as men by instinct, provision. God gave us the instinct to provide for our children and for our wives. The requirement gets us into warrior mode that sometimes our wives don't quite understand, but that's what we do. It's how God wired us. I remember the night that Stephen was born. At the time, I was working at FedEx as one of the engineers on the flight simulators. I had a young apprentice working with me. His name was Kerry. He had been at FedEx right out of college. He'd been there about 2 weeks. And he was just still trying to, didn't even know where the bathroom was yet. We had the simulator in about 1,000 pieces, 727-200 simulator. And I got the call at 2 a.m. or whatever it was, that 4 a.m.? Okay, 4 a.m. See, I told you I can't remember stuff. That Kelly's water had broken and we were going to the hospital. So I left my apprentice there with the simulator in 1,000,000 pieces. And I got one of the older guys to go up and help him, but he said, yeah, I'm going to give him 30 minutes to sweat it out before I go help him. But the point is that when we got to the hospital and Stephen was born, when I held him in my arms, everything changed. I all of a sudden understood what it really means to have the responsibility of providing. When we get married, we feel that to some extent, because we have a wife and we feel like we have to provide, and that's natural. But it's not until you have a helpless baby, your own helpless baby in your arms, that you realize, oh wow, now it's for keeps. It's for real now, and I've really got to pay attention to what I'm doing. The same thing happened when Alan was born, of course, but I was expecting at that time, so it didn't hit me quite as hard. But even today, a friend of mine had a baby 6 months ago. How old was Brian's baby? 6 months? Three. Shows what I know. 3 months ago, and I kept telling him, you have no idea what's about to hit you. And he told me a day or two after, he said, you were right. I had no idea. But that's the way it is, and all of us who have children experience that. The responsibility crashes in on us, even in the secular world. the man has long been expected to provide for his family. The traditional story of a marriage proposal is what we'll think of as a young man approaching his father-in-law-to-be to explain how he intends to take care of his bride and to care for their children. But we never think of a bride-to-be approaching her future mother-in-law to discuss how she intends to take care of the young man. We don't think of it that way. It even sounds funny to even consider that. And that's even in an age where 60% of married households are two-income households, as compared to 1900 when that number was only 5%. 1 Timothy 5:8 shows us that we are expected to desire to provide for our families as men, casting great disdain on a man who does not pursue the natural role of provider. It says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. It's pretty harsh words. Most of us understand the provider role, and we pursue it with gusto. We make it knocked around a little bit in the pursuit of providing for our families, but we always get back up. And we continue the effort with no less enthusiasm. But honestly, the provider role is really just pedestrian. It's a given. It's not really our main function. We need to look more at the more important role of leadership, spiritual leadership. But before I dive into that, I want to give a warning. There's part of this that isn't comfortable. You likely won't like all of it. I don't like even saying all of it because it's a message that is to me just as much as it is to anyone else. I gave the instruction at the first service to not come to me afterwards and tell me that you enjoyed it, because this is not a sermon that is enjoyable. It's okay to come to me and tell me that God spoke to you or that you have a new perspective, or to go jump in the lake even. You can tell me that, but don't tell me you enjoyed it. It's going to be an honest, biblical, sugar-free truth. Ephesians 5:23-25. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. God intends our wives to manage the children and the household, the daily operations, but he intends that we manage our wives. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a master-slave relationship or a military sergeant and private type relationship with a command and execute type of arrangement, but that's not what God intends at all. What God really means is more like a leader or guide type of relationship. When Alan and I were in Europe last month, on one particular day, we were scheduled to go to the Vatican. That was the only day during our 2 weeks in Europe that we had someone hired to be our guide, because the Vatican is massive. It's just absolutely huge. It's more than you can take in. So it's best to have one who knows the place, who can get you to specifically the places that you want to be. When Stephen and I were there 3 years ago, we did the same thing. We had a guide, because you can't take it all in. Our guide that Alan and I had, what was his name? Alan, you remember?
I do not.
Seems like father, like son.
Like Tony.
I called him Tony in the first service. So
It wasn't Tony, I know that.
we'll call him Tony because he was Italian. Tony's job was to show us the places in the Vatican and the artwork in the Vatican that we would want to see. So the first thing he did was to get a little bit of how you remember as we're walking to the Vatican, he was asking us what we wanted to see. So there were 4 of us in the group, plus the guide. So we were giving him an idea of what we wanted to see. But he was still the guide. He sought our counsel on what we wanted to see. But it was still his job to lead us and take us to those places that would be interesting to see. Everybody wants to see the obvious things like the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica. But there's also a lot of other things there. The Vatican has the largest art collection in the world. They have over 6 million pieces of art, which is a lot. It's not all on display. The smallest fraction of it is on display. Even so, it's too much to see. So Tony is leading us around, showing us what he knows is the things that we should see. So we were submitting to his authority as leader. He listened to what we had to say, saw our counsel on what we wanted to see, but he was still the leader, the head. And he used that office to serve us. That is, he was a servant leader. But let's propose for a moment that Tony had not been a good leader. Let's say that he had tried to lead us to see the Vatican accounting offices instead of the Sistine Chapel. It would surely have been less crowded because the Sistine Chapel is not really a lot bigger than this sanctuary is. Maybe twice this size, I would say. It's a fairly small place. But they pack about 4,000 people in there at once. So we'd gone to the accounting offices, there would have been a lot fewer people there, but we would have not wanted to do that. We would not have been obedient to his leadership. We would have instead abandoned his leadership, and we would have sought to find our own way. We wouldn't have done a very good job of it, but even on our own, we would have stumbled across at least something more interesting than going to see an accounting office. If you're an accountant, I don't mean that to be offensive, it's just your desk isn't very interesting compared to artwork by Raphael and Michelangelo and things like that. But he didn't do that, of course. But if he had, we would not have followed him there. We wanted to see other things. Just as Tony was our servant leader, God calls us as the husbands of our wives and fathers of our children to be servant leaders. We're called to be the guide and the authority, but all the while seeking counsel from our wives. It's often easier said than done. We're going to look at 3 ways in which we fail to hit the mark. The first way we fail in our servant leadership role is when we get so busy in the provision role that we ignore the far more important role of spiritual leadership. When I was at FedEx, there was a period of time for about 1.5 or 2 years where my third-level manager pulled me aside and dotted me directly to himself. I was tied at the hip to him. And my function was to follow him around and learn how to do his job. He was grooming me to take over his position. I spent a lot of time with vice presidents and senior vice presidents and people with long titles like that. And I learned a great deal about how business operates at that level. I didn't like what I saw. This was mostly men who were fairly miserable. Not in every case, of course, but for the most part, it was a rough, backstabbing type of environment, even within the corporation. After a while, I decided that it wasn't worth it. Sure, the income would have been high, but the sacrifice would have been far too great. I went to the man who was my third-level manager and told him that I didn't want to pursue that. He was not happy with me at all. In fact, he was rather livid. He had invested quite a bit and told his vice president that I was the up-and-coming guy, and here I was walking away from it. He didn't understand it at all. After a couple of weeks, I tried to explain it to him, but he just didn't understand it. But after a couple of weeks, he came to me with tears welling in his eyes, and he had obviously been thinking about it a lot over that 2-week period. And he said, "You're making the right decision." He said, "I wish I had made that same decision 25 years ago." This man had lost his wife, and even to this day, he's estranged from his adult son. He gave it up to that corporation. He and I actually stayed in contact with each other, even though I've been gone from FedEx for 15 years. We have a special relationship because of what God gave me the grace to avoid that he had to go through. Many families have been sacrificed on the American altar of greed, like his was. And I, for one, say it's high time that we admit that blind pursuit of the American dream is too expensive when it costs us our families. If all that Tony the tour guide had cared about was collecting his fee, then he would not have been very committed to leading us so carefully like he did. And we would have been left severely wanting. He would have sacrificed us being blinded by the money. Fortunately, he didn't do that. The second way we fail in our servant leadership role is when we adopt the king of the castle mentality. Now, I have to admit that I've gotten in that mode a few times. There's a running joke in our family where Alan was talking about something that he owned. I don't remember what it was, probably some piece of musical gear. And I said to him, "You own nothing," because I know something about the laws of the state of Mississippi. Brother Tommy would agree with me that Alan owns nothing because he's under 18. I own it all, right, Tommy? I said it somewhat in jest, but it still shows the king of the castle mentality. And so even just a couple of days ago, I said to Alan, "You own nothing." But of course, we can't be that way. It's not leadership, it's narcissism. It destroys families. Our wives will not follow that, neither will our children. The third way we fail in our servant leadership role is when we don't seek our wife's counsel. That leads us into a tailspin. Let's consider a scenario in which a man gets in a mode of selfishly doing whatever he wants with no regard for his wife's discerning counsel. She gets frustrated and offers it anyway. Rather than recognizing the error of his ways, the man ignores what he considers to be her meddling and just keeps doing what he wants. She may not consciously recognize it, but she chooses to do what is best for herself and their children by choosing to not follow his lead. She does her best to substitute as leader, but she's just not cut out for that. That's not the way God designed her. She breaks from his leadership and goes in a different direction, but it's not her fault. It's the man's fault, just as with Adam and Eve. Eve may have been the one who first suggested to eat from the apple, but it was Adam's job to stand up and say, "No, that's not right," and lead his wife the other way. He is responsible for Eve's failure. In fact, it doesn't really matter whether the woman does the right thing or the wrong thing when she chooses, in the situation of improper leadership, to do something on her own. She's doing the best she can, but it's the man's fault. It is up to us to lead our lives. We should not abdicate our leadership. But there are a great many homes across the nation where this has happened, and there's a good wife doing the best that she can to fulfill her own role, as well as the role that her husband should be providing. But God did not design her to be the head of the house. And I don't mean just homes where there has been divorce. I mean homes where the man is still in the house, but he might as well not be there. Having abdicated his servant leadership role to his wife, he's afraid to stand up and lead, afraid that she won't follow him. But there's courage to be found. A wife doesn't really want it to be this way. If Tony had gone off without us to the accounting office and then returned to us from the Vatican accounting office, had returned to us and found us after an hour or so, we would have been overjoyed to have him back. The fact that he had taken the wrong step and deserted us for a time, for a season, would have in no way changed the fact that God designed him to be the leader. And we would once again have put him in that role, and we'd be glad to have it. The fact that we may have abandoned our post for a season doesn't mean that our wife and kids don't still need us as a servant leader. A wife desperately desires that her husband take that role. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Again, that's Ephesians 5:23. What does it really mean? Sometimes we have a picture of Christ as sitting in a nice garden among the flowers. But that's not really accurate. Christ was a man's man. He worked in a carpenter shop before power tools. That's not easy to do. Imagine building a pew like one of these with just a handsaw, which, by the way, is a cordless saw, and a similar cordless hammer. Very difficult work. He fought Satan and won. He overthrew tables and drove out the money changers. He willingly underwent a brutal physical torture for our sake. He wasn't like Mr. Rogers, he was more like John Wayne. If we as men stand up and swagger like John Wayne, our wives will follow that. Our wives will thank God for it and shout to the heavens, it's about time. Now some men want to say, that's not my wife, she's too stubborn, and she wants things her own way. Kelly knows what I'm going to say next. I can tell you this, that there's nobody more stubborn than she is. But I actually see that as a good attribute, because I'm the other way around in many things. I will sometimes change with the wind, but she is steady, and she keeps me on an even keel. You won't find a house more efficiently, effectively, lovingly, and thoroughly managed than ours on a daily basis. And Kelly's stubbornness and steadfastness is a big part of that. You could ask Stephen and Alan, they'll tell you the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to steering the ship, Kelly follows my lead. I'm not in any way saying that I'm always good at it. In fact, I'll tell you just the opposite. I'm not always good at it. I'm more often not good at it. I don't know how many times I've had to go to my children and my wife and ask for forgiveness. But they always accept me back. I still claim it as my role. The fact that I'm not particularly good at it all the time doesn't mean that I advocate the role. It is what God has given me as a responsibility. 2.5 years ago, Kelly and I started a computer business in 1996. 2.5 years ago, I went to my #1 employee, Brian, and I said to him, I will sell you this business for $1 because I'm ready to be done with it. Didn't really have any idea what we were going to do. He accepted, and to this day has not given me my $1. But Kelly and I just began praying. We went on about a 3 or 4 month period of time where we just prayed through what God had for us next in the next chapter. We got to a point where we were willing to consider anything. But the most important thing that happened during that is the most important, most beautiful thing I've ever heard my wife say. We were sitting on the patio out back, and she said to me, I will follow you wherever God leads. Not many men are that blessed to have a wife who will do that. Because we were looking at possibly a reduction in income by a significant amount. 70–80% reduction with some of the options we were looking at. She didn't care. She was ready to be on board with what God had for us because she saw her husband focusing on God. Eventually, just so you'll know the rest of the story, we got to a point where our hearts caught up with our heads, and we recognized on one Thursday afternoon that we would do anything at all. There were about 8 or 10 options before us, but we were truly ready to do anything at all that God would bring to us. We just wanted to know when and where. If that meant getting on an airplane that night and never coming back to this area, then that was fine. Whatever you wanted. When our hearts got to that position, that very night, the doors that were open to us started closing. Within just a few days, all but one of the options was gone. The only option that remained was to stay with the computer business in a reduced capacity. So I called up Brian to say, why don't I stay with the computer business and do sales and customer relationship type work, because Brian's not particularly good at that. I called him up, he answered the phone, and he said, hey, I was just about to call you. Would you like to stay on with the computer business and do sales and customer relationship work? Well, that was a pretty obvious confirmation that that's what I was supposed to do. And that's what I'm still doing. Somebody lost my place. I don't want to miss what God has for me. I don't want my wife to miss what God has for her. I I don't want my boys to miss what God has for them. The world we live in likes to get in the way of that. But what could possibly be more important to us as men than to desire to follow with reckless abandon the path that God has designed for each of us, and to make sure that everyone in our household is pursuing the same thing? It's time for the men of God to stand up and be counted. This Father's Day, tell your wife and your children that you will commit to lead your family the way God intends. You don't have to know even what that means, really. We can all learn that. All we need to know to get started is that God wants it to happen, so the result has to be good. And we also need to keep in mind that the call is to servant leadership, not to kingdomship. You won't be playing golf every Saturday, followed by a Sunday afternoon watching football. You won't get much of what the world calls man time, but you'll get everything of what God calls man time. He'll draw you close and he'll show you things that will amaze you. Here's a few practical starters. Husbands, pray for your family. I don't mean good food, good meat, good God, let's eat. I mean deep prayer with everyone involved, kids included, offering your prayers together. Husbands, know your wives' and children's spiritual condition. We're responsible for it. We'll be held accountable to it. Husbands, rejoice and make a huge deal of it when your kids get saved, because it is a huge deal. Stephen, you said there were 40 kids that made a decision for Christ in VBS. There should be 40 dads rejoicing this week. Husbands, let your kids see and know that you love the Lord with all your heart. Husbands, come to church, get involved in the ministries, help with VBS and other projects. We've about killed ourselves over VBS for lack of sufficient strong manly help. That's just the honest truth. I take notice of something like that because my wife is working 60 hours a week for 2 weeks to make sure everything gets done. I know that the folks that did help, everyone worked hard. It shouldn't have to be that difficult. We should have enough people. Husbands, help Pastor Biddick with his vision for turning this church from an inside-the-walls church to an outside-the-walls church, which this community desperately needs. Wives, tell your husband that you will follow his lead. There will be adjustments. There will be times when you don't get your way, but you'll find comfort you have never known before in your husband's new strength, found in following his plan for the family structure. It doesn't make any sense, but when my wife told me that she would follow me wherever God led, I have never seen such comfort in her eyes than in that moment, even though that was perhaps one of the most unknown moments we've ever had. We didn't know where we were really going. Let's look at one more relationship that Ephesians 5:23 applies to. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. As long as Jesus tarries, the church pastor is Christ's representative in the local church. He is the servant leader for the church. The role is parallel. The pastor is to the church just as the man is to the family. Hebrews 13:17 tells us, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls. As men, you will have to give account. As father, man is called to be a caring head and a guardian of the home, a divinely established role in the natural family, which must be reflected in the church, because the church is the extended family of God. I want to submit this to you. As fathers, we have allowed our role to be usurped in the home so thoroughly that we don't even recognize that we are supposed to submit to the pastor's leadership in the same way that our wives are supposed to submit to ours. I know that the Methodist Book of Discipline calls for a certain structure, but the Bible calls for the pastor to lead the church and for the men of the church to lead their families in following the pastor. We've not done a good job of that by any measure. So in other words, I'm saying that we don't know how to follow the pastor because we aren't practicing leadership in our own homes the way we should. Last week, Scooter spoke about Christ's letter to the church in Laodicea. Now, Laodicea was a town that was in between two towns, one of which had cold water and one of which had hot water. Laodicea didn't have any water at all. So they piped in water from both places. Now, cold water is great because it's refreshing. Warm water is, or hot water is great for bathing, and it was believed to have medicinal purposes at the time as well. But lukewarm water has decidedly very little value. So in the letter to the town at Laodicea, to the church at Laodicea, when Christ says, you are neither hot nor cold, he's not saying, cold is not referring to evil and hot to good. Cold and hot both have value. What he's talking about is you either have value or you don't. Cold and hot water have value. Lukewarm water has neither. So the description of you are neither hot nor cold would have been very acute to the people at Laodicea, because they full well knew that they had to deal with lukewarm water all the time. We are the church at Laodicea. There's not even the smallest ground to stand on to deny it. My copy of the Bible doesn't say, come to church once a week and make a pew warm for an hour. It doesn't say all you have to do is donate enough so you don't feel guilty. It doesn't say as long as you tell the preacher that you enjoyed the sermon, you don't really have to seriously consider doing what he instructs. What it does say is to go into the world and preach the gospel, here, there, and everywhere. What it does say is to not rest on our laurels, but pursue Christ with vigor. What it does say is to be in the world, but not of the world. What it does say is that in our present condition, we are lukewarm. We are Laodicea. And as such, we are not useful. I want to be part of a useful church. I want to be part of a church that is focused on kingdom work. I want to be part of a church where the men see that come into Sunday school and Wednesday night study and Sunday night prayer time is good and useful. I want to be part of a church where the men understand that making their kids come to church doesn't turn them into adults that don't like church. Unchurched adults are created when kids grow up watching a dad whose attitude about church is lackadaisical. I want to be part of a church that sees that expecting the pastor to do 2 services is an undue burden for a total of 130 people. Now, that's not a popular thing to say, and I understand that. But it's still the truth. We should be able to come together as a community and come up with a way to worship together, because we are one family. As it is, we're operating as 2. I want to be part of a church where the kingdom work is being done by more than just the pastor and 8 or 10 other people. The pastor should be the last person doing the daily chores of running the church. Anyone who's run a business knows how difficult it is to try to keep your arms around strategy and vision and direction when you're having to help stock the back room and fix the broken sink. Pastor Biddick is not an employee sent here to keep the church daily operations running like a wife does at home. He's here to lead the kingdom work, and we should free him to do that. I want to be part of a church that recognizes that the pastor is not here to do our part of the kingdom work for us. He's not a gospel spreader that we have hired. We are all to do that. I want to be part of a church that gets the difference between self-serving work and kingdom work. Here's a few examples. A breakfast for ourselves is comfortable. A breakfast for the homeless in the community is kingdom work. A building like the Flame that is used 2 hours a week is nice to have, even if its financial burden is ever present. A building like the Flame that is used to host community basketball or a kids after school program, and a lot of other options that we could come up with without a lot of thought. Using that to spread the gospel, that's kingdom work and good stewardship. Watch how God will bless good stewardship when we start using the Flame for kingdom work. God will kill that debt in a hurry. An Easter cross that's covered with carefully planned and designed flowers is pretty, but an Easter cross that is covered with an unpredictable, eclectic mix of random flowers, although it may not be as pretty, with those flowers literally brought and attached by members of the community at large, that elicits the true beauty of the cross, because it allows each person to connect with the cross physically and spiritually. An expectation that we can sit in the comfortable air conditioning and the community will come to the church on their own is naive, but an expectation that we have to get on our feet and put in blood, sweat, and tears to physically work to reach this community with servant evangelism is kingdom work. An attitude that following Christ requires 2 hours a week is a charade. An attitude that following Christ is a 24/7 mindset is pure joy. God is looking for men who are willing to stand up and be counted as righteous leaders in their homes. He is looking for men who are willing to stand behind their pastor who wants to tear down these walls and make this a church that is truly in the community, not just a building that's planted here. Men, if we get our own houses in order, our homes will become God-centered and thriving. Our church will become filled with men properly following its pastor. Let us join Joshua and commit to the proclamation, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The word of God for the people of God.
Thank you, God.